Every father knows the weight of watching his children's dreams slip away because he can't provide. Caleb Marsh felt that crushing burden every single day after losing his job and facing foreclosure on their family home. Then came the letter from England. His family laughed when they heard he'd inherited a medieval castle. His wealthy in-laws called it a joke. His siblings shook their heads at another one of Caleb's failures. Even the neighbors whispered about the struggling widower chasing fairy tales. But that crumbling castle held a secret buried for centuries. Hidden beneath the foundation was an ancient vault containing documents tied to a royal trust worth $300 million. What his family saw as ruins, Caleb would discover was actually the key to changing everything. The question was simple. Would a man who'd been knocked down his whole life finally find the strength to stand up and claim what was rightfully his? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the worn curtains of the small ranch house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across a room that had seen better days. Caleb Marsh sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of overdue bills that seemed to multiply overnight, like some cruel magic trick. The foreclosure notice lay on top bright red letters, spelling out a 30-day deadline that felt more like a death sentence. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the family portrait sitting beside the bills. Sarah smiled back at him from the silver frame, her arms wrapped around their 3 children in what felt like a lifetime ago. 2 years had passed since the cancer took her, but the grief still hit him in waves, especially in moments like these when the weight of single parenthood felt unbearable. "Dad, we're out of cereal again." 10-year-old Emma padded into the kitchen in her worn pajamas. Her blonde hair, a tangle of cowlicks that reminded him so much of her mother, it made his chest ache. "I'll pick some up today, sweetheart," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure how. His last unemployment check had barely covered the electric bill. 14-year-old Michael appeared next, already dressed for school in jeans that were getting too short and a t-shirt with a hole near the collar. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson called about the field trip money again. It's due today." Caleb's stomach knotted. The $15 fee might as well have been $1,500. "I'll call her this morning. Maybe she can give us a few more days." 8-year-old Lucy bounced in with the resilient energy that only children possessed, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had settled over their home like fog. "Daddy, can we have pancakes?" "Please, pretty please with extra syrup." "How about toast instead?" Caleb forced a smile. "Pancakes are for weekends." But even the bread was running low. He'd been stretching everything: meals, groceries, hope itself. 6 months ago, he'd been an assistant manager at Henderson Manufacturing, earning enough to keep them comfortable. Then the company downsized, and suddenly 38-year-old men with high school educations were expendable. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd lost his job working for his late wife's family. Richard Henderson, Sarah's brother, had delivered the news with all the warmth of a winter morning. "Nothing personal, Caleb, just business." But the way Richard's eyes had avoided his suggested it was very personal indeed. The Hendersons had never thought Sarah married well. They'd made that clear from the beginning, with their country club memberships and vacation homes, their children's private school educations and trust funds. Caleb was the blue-collar guy who'd won Sarah's heart in college, much to her family's dismay. She'd chosen love over status, and for 15 wonderful years it had been enough. Now, without Sarah as a buffer, the Hendersons barely acknowledged his existence. When they did visit the children, their disapproval hung in the air, like expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. They brought elaborate gifts Caleb couldn't match, and spoke in coded language about better opportunities and more stable environments. His own siblings weren't much better. David, the successful lawyer in Chicago, had made it clear that Caleb's struggles were self-inflicted. "You need to pull yourself together, man. Those kids deserve better than this." Rebecca, married to a surgeon in Seattle, offered hollow sympathy wrapped in judgment. "Maybe it's time to consider what's really best for Emma, Michael, and Lucy." The suggestion underneath was clear. maybe he wasn't what was best for them. Caleb watched his children navigate their morning routine with the adaptability of resilience born from necessity. Emma helped Lucy tie her shoes. Michael made sure everyone had their backpacks. They'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't have, not to mention friends' birthday parties they couldn't afford to attend, not to complain about the generic groceries or the thermostat kept low to save money. It broke his heart how good they'd become at being okay with less. "Bus is coming," Michael called from the window. The morning rush began, lunchboxes that held more hope than food, hugs that lingered a little longer lately, promises that everything would work out. Caleb stood in the doorway watching the yellow bus disappear down the street, carrying away the three people who meant everything to him. The house felt hollow in their absence. He walked back to the kitchen table, where the bills waited with patient malevolence. 30 days to find $6,000 or lose the only home his children had ever known. The bank had already denied his loan modification request. His job search had yielded nothing but rejection letters and automated responses. He picked up Sarah's portrait, tracing her face with his thumb. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered. "I'm failing them. I'm failing you." The silence that answered him was broken only by the persistent drip of the kitchen faucet he couldn't afford to fix. Outside, Mrs. Goldman from next door was watering her perfect flower garden, probably wondering how long before the neighborhood eyesore that was his overgrown lawn would drag down property values. Caleb had always been the quiet one, the steady one, the guy who kept his head down and did his work. Sarah had been the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities where others saw problems. She'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings, in the kind of magic that made ordinary people extraordinary. He'd loved that about her, even as he gently tempered her expectations with practical reality. Now he wished he'd borrowed some of her faith, her certainty that things had a way of working out for people who deserved it. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, probably another debt collector or telemarketer. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Caleb Marsh." The voice was crisp, professionally British. "Speaking. My name is Jonathan Whitfield, solicitor with Whitfield, Pemberton, Associates in London. I'm calling regarding the estate of Lord Edmund Blackwood." Caleb frowned. "I think you have the wrong number. I don't know any Lord Blackwood." "Actually, Mr. Marsh, Lord Blackwood was your great-great-grandfather's cousin. I have documentation showing you as his nearest living relative and heir to his estate." The words seemed to float in the air without meaning. "I'm sorry, what?" "You've inherited Blackwood Castle, Mr. Marsh. I'll be sending the formal paperwork by courier this afternoon. Congratulations." Caleb sank into his chair, staring at the foreclosure notice while processing impossible words about castles and inheritances. "Are you sure you have the right person?" "Quite sure, sir. Edmund Blackwood passed away 3 months ago, at the age of 91. His genealogical research identified you as his heir. The castle has been in your family line for over 400 years. After the call ended, Caleb sat in stunned silence. A castle. In England. It had to be some kind of mistake or scam, the kind of thing that preyed on desperate people with promises too good to be true. But when the courier arrived that afternoon, with an official-looking package bearing British legal seals, reality began to shift. Documents with letterheads, photographs of an imposing stone structure against rolling green hills, maps showing its location in the English countryside. By the time the children returned from school, Caleb had read through everything twice. The castle was real, the inheritance was legitimate. There were also property taxes, maintenance costs, and legal fees that would make ownership virtually impossible for someone in his situation. "What's all this stuff, Dad?" Emma asked, climbing onto his lap to examine the papers. "Just some paperwork, sweetheart." But Michael, sharp-eyed and suspicious of anything that disrupted their carefully managed routine, picked up one of the photographs. "Is this a castle?" "It appears to be." "Whose castle?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Well, apparently it's ours now." The explosion of excitement from Emma and Lucy was immediate and joyful. Michael remained skeptical, studying the documents with an expression far too serious for a 14-year-old. "What's the catch, Dad?" "Smart boy. Sarah would have been proud. The catch is it's in England. It's probably falling apart, and we can't afford to keep it even if it's free." But Emma was already spinning around the living room, her arms outstretched like she was dancing in a ballroom. "We're royalty. We're going to live in a castle." "We're not royalty, and we're not going anywhere," Caleb said gently. "This is our home." Though for how much longer remained to be seen. That evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb called his brother David. The conversation went exactly as expected. "A castle? Come on, Caleb. This is obviously some kind of scam. I had it verified. It's legitimate. Even if it's real, what are you going to do with a castle? You can barely keep the lights on as it is." The dismissal stung because it was true, but something in Caleb bristled at his brother's tone, the same condescension he'd been hearing from everyone lately. "I don't know yet." "Well, I hope you're not getting the kids' hopes up. They've been through enough disappointment." After David hung up, Caleb walked to the children's rooms, checking on them as he did every night. Emma slept with the photograph of the castle under her pillow. Lucy had drawn a picture of the family standing in front of the imposing structure, complete with flags and horses. Even practical Michael had the inheritance documents stacked neatly on his desk. For the first time in months, they'd gone to bed, excited about something. Caleb returned to the kitchen table where the bills waited alongside the castle paperwork. Two different futures spread before him like paths in a forest. One led deeper into the familiar darkness of struggle and eventual defeat. The other led towards something unknown, probably foolish, possibly wonderful. Sarah's portrait smiled at him from its place of honor. What would she have said about all this? He could almost hear her voice, gentle but determined. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is believe in something impractical. Maybe she was right. Maybe fairy tales didn't always come with guarantees, but that didn't mean they never came true. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Caleb made himself a cup of coffee with the last of the grounds and settled in to read every word of the inheritance documents one more time. Somewhere across the ocean, Blackwood Castle waited. The official documents arrived 3 days later in a package thick enough to stop a bullet. Caleb spread them across his kitchen table while the children were at school, studying each page with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust good fortune. The castle deed was the centerpiecean, imposing document written in formal legal language, bearing official seals and ribbons that spoke of centuries of tradition. The parchment felt substantial under his fingers, older than anything he'd ever owned. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Blackwood Castle, Thornwick, England," followed by a coat of arms featuring a raven perched on a crown. Lord Edmund Blackwood had been 91 when he died, according to the genealogical research included in the package. A bachelor with no direct heirs, he'd spent the last decade of his life tracing his family lineage back through centuries of records. The documentation was exhaustive birth certificates, marriage records, immigration papers from Caleb's great-great-grandfather, who'd left England in 1892, seeking opportunity in America. The Blackwood line stretches back to 1387. The accompanying letter explained. Your ancestor, Thomas Blackwood, was granted the lands by King Richard II for services to the crown. While the family fortune was lost over the centuries, the property remained in trust. Caleb studied the photographs of the castle with growing fascination. It wasn't the fairy tale structure Emma had imagined, no soaring spires or gleaming towers. Instead, it was a fortress built for permanence rather than beauty. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, and a heavy wooden door that looked like it could withstand a siege. Parts of the roof had caved in, ivy covered most of the exterior walls, and what had once been manicured grounds were now overgrown with wild grass and brambles. But there was something about it that stirred something deep in his chest. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light caught the remaining intact tower, or how the structure seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if it had always been there and always would be. It looked like the kind of place where a man could make a stand. The financial documents were less inspiring. Property taxes, utility costs, structural assessments that read like medical reports for a terminally ill patient. The roof needed complete replacement. The electrical system hadn't been updated since the 1940s, and the plumbing was described as historically authentic but functionally challenged. Conservative estimates put the restoration costs at over £200,000 money that might as well have been on the moon for all the access Caleb had to it. When the children came home from school, they found him still surrounded by paperwork. Emma immediately gravitated toward the photographs, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's like something from a movie, Dad. Look at how thick those walls are. We could be safe from anything in there." Michael examined the deed with the same careful attention Caleb had given it. "This says the castle comes with 47 acres of land. That's huge." Lucy pointed to the coat of arms. "Why is there a bird on our flag?" "It's a raven," Caleb explained. "Ravens are supposed to be very intelligent birds. They remember things for a long time and they're loyal to their families." "Like us," Lucy said with the simple confidence of a child who'd never doubted where she belonged. That evening, Caleb called Richard Henderson. The conversation was predictably brief and brutal. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard's voice carried the sharp edge it took on when he discussed anything related to Caleb's judgment. "You're talking about uprooting those children and dragging them to some falling-down ruin in a foreign country. It's not foreign. They speak English." "Don't be cute, Caleb. You know what I mean. You're facing foreclosure here, and instead of finding a real solution, you're chasing some fantasy about being lord of the manor." The dismissal in Richard's tone sparked something defensive in Caleb's chest. Maybe it's not a fantasy. Maybe it's an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To put those kids through more instability, to fail in a more exotic location, to give them something better than what I can offer them here. What you can offer them here is consistency, family support, and a chance at a normal life. What you're proposing is running away. After Richard hung up, which he did without saying goodbye, Caleb sat in the growing darkness of his living room. The foreclosure notice still lay on the kitchen table alongside the castle documents, two futures demanding a choice. His sister Rebecca called an hour later, her tone softer but her message equally clear. "I've been talking to Richard," she began, which meant the family had already held a conference about Caleb's mental state. "We're all worried about you. This castle thing, it's not real, honey. It's not a solution. The castle is real. The inheritance is legitimate. Even if it is, you can't afford to maintain it. You'll end up worse off than you are now, except you'll be stranded thousands of miles from anyone who can help you." "Maybe I don't want help anymore," Caleb said, surprising himself with the edge in his voice. "Maybe I want to stand on my own feet for once." "With what money? Using what skills? Caleb, you're a good man and a loving father, but you're not equipped for something like this. Let the lawyers sell the castle, take whatever money you can get from it, and use that to get back on your feet here where you belong." Where you belong. The phrase echoed after Rebecca hung up. Where did he belong? In this house that was about to be taken from him, working jobs that could disappear without warning, accepting charity from family members who saw him as a burden. David called the next morning with the same message wrapped in legal terminology. "I've looked into the property records," he said with the authority of someone accustomed to being right. "This castle is a money pit. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you inside a year. And that's assuming you can even afford to get over there in the first place. What if? There is no what if, Caleb. This is reality talking. You have 3 children depending on you to make rational decisions. Don't let desperation make you stupid." But as Caleb hung up the phone, he realized that desperation might be exactly what he needed. Safe choices had led him here to this kitchen table covered in unpaid bills, to this life of gradual defeat. Maybe it was time to make an unsafe choice. He found the children in the backyard, Emma pushing Lucy on the tire swing while Michael read in the shade of the old oak tree. They looked up when he approached, and he saw something in their faces he hadn't seen in months. "I've been thinking about the castle," he said. "And?" Michael prompted when Caleb paused. Caleb looked at his children, at the house behind them that would soon belong to someone else, at the neighborhood where they'd lived their entire lives, but where they'd never truly belonged to anything larger than themselves. "And I think we should go see it." Emma launched herself off the swing and into his arms. "Really? We're really going to England?" "Just to look," Caleb said, though something in his chest suggested it might be more than that. "Just to see what we're dealing with." Michael closed his book, his expression serious. "What about school? What about everything here?" "What's here that we can't leave?" Caleb asked. "We're losing the house anyway. You'll have to change schools regardless." It was true, though saying it out loud made it real in a way that hurt. "But what if the castle is terrible?" Lucy asked. "What if it's scary and cold and full of ghosts?" Caleb knelt down to her level. "Then we come home and figure out something else." "But what if it's not terrible? What if it's the beginning of something wonderful?" "Like Mom used to say," Emma added. "She always said we should never be afraid to try something new." Sarah had said that. She'd believed in taking chances, in the magic of new beginnings. She'd believed that ordinary people could have extraordinary lives if they were brave enough to reach for them. "So we're really doing this?" Michael asked. Caleb looked at the castle deed, still spread across the picnic table where he'd brought it to show them the land survey. 47 acres. A structure that had stood for over 600 years. A name that belonged to them, that connected them to something larger than their current circumstances. "We're really doing this," he said. The plane tickets cost money they didn't have, charged to a credit card that was already maxed out. But something had shifted in Caleb since making the decision. For the first time in months, he felt like he was moving toward something instead of running away from it. The Hendersons and his siblings could call it foolishness. The neighbors could whisper about the family that had finally cracked under pressure. None of that mattered anymore. They were going to see their castle. The village of Thornwick appeared through the rental car window, like something from a storybook that had been left out in the rain too long. Narrow cobblestone streets wound between stone cottages with thatched roofs, their gardens wild with roses and ivy. A small church with a bell tower stood at the village center, surrounded by shops that looked like they hadn't changed in centuries. But there was something tired about it all. Empty storefronts with "For Let" signs in dusty windows, gardens that were more weeds than flowers, streets that seemed to echo with the footsteps of people who were no longer there. "It's so quiet," Emma whispered from the back seat, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever ghosts lingered in the narrow lanes. Caleb pulled up beside the village pub, the Raven's Rest, its wooden sign creaking in the late afternoon breeze. A few locals sat at outdoor tables, their conversations stopping as they noticed the American strangers peering through car windows. "Are we lost?" Lucy asked, pressing her face against the glass. "I don't think so," Caleb said, checking the directions the solicitor had provided. "The castle should be just up that hill." They drove through the village and up a winding road lined with ancient oak trees. At the crest of the hill, the road opened into a circular drive. And there it was, Blackwood Castle, even more imposing in person than in the photographs. The structure rose from the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built. Massive stone blocks formed walls that were easily 10 feet thick, punctuated by narrow windows that watched the approach like hooded eyes. One of the 4 corner towers had partially collapsed, its stones scattered across the overgrown courtyard like broken teeth. "It's enormous," Michael breathed, his usual skepticism temporarily forgotten. Caleb parked near what had once been the main entrance and stepped out into the English countryside air. It smelled of rain and roses, of grass that had grown wild and time that had passed slowly. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no sounds of modern life. Just the wind through the trees and the distant call of actual ravens. The massive wooden door was secured with a chain and padlock, but Jonathan Whitfield had provided keys along with warnings about structural instability. Caleb fumbled with the ancient lock, while his children pressed close behind him, their excitement tempered by the imposing reality of their inheritance. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through centuries. Inside, shafts of late afternoon light streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating a great hall that took Caleb's breath away. The space was vast, easily 40 feet long and 20 feet high, with massive wooden beams supporting what remained of the ceiling. A fireplace large enough to roast an entire pig dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing into shadows above. "This is where knights used to eat," Emma said, her voice hushed with wonder. "And where we could eat too," Lucy added practically, "if we had any food." They explored room by room, their footsteps echoing on stone floors worn smooth by centuries of use. Most of the furniture was gone, sold off over the years to pay for maintenance. What remained was covered in dust sheets like sleeping ghosts. The kitchen was a maze of stone ovens and copper pots, gone green with age. Upstairs, bedrooms with arrow-slit windows offered views across rolling countryside that stretched to the horizon. "Look at this," Michael called from one of the tower rooms. Caleb climbed the narrow spiral staircase to find his son standing beside a wooden chest filled with old documents and photographs. Michael held up a yellowed newspaper clipping the Thornwick Chronicle, dated 1943. The headline read, "Blackwood Castle serves as haven for London children during the Blitz." Below was a photograph showing dozens of children playing in the courtyard while adults watched from the castle steps. The story described how Lord Edmund's father had opened the castle to families fleeing the bombing of London, housing over 100 people during the worst of the war. "The Blackwood family has always opened their doors to those in need." The article quoted Lord Blackwood as saying, "These old walls have sheltered many families over the centuries. They can shelter a few more." Emma appeared beside them, having climbed the stairs with Lucy close behind. "We helped people," she said, studying the photograph. "Our family helped save children." It was the first time any of them had said, "our family," in connection with the Blackwoods, and something shifted in the tower room. This wasn't just a building they'd inherited, it was a legacy, a responsibility that stretched back through generations. "Dad," Lucy said, tugging at his jacket, "there are people outside." They looked out the arrow-slit window to see a small group of villagers standing in the courtyard, watching the castle with curious expressions. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward as Caleb emerged from the main entrance. "You must be the Americans," she said, her accent crisp and welcoming. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore, village historian and chief busybody. We heard you'd arrived." "Caleb Marsh," he replied, shaking her offered hand. "These are my children, Emma, Michael, and Lucy. Welcome to Thornwick." Eleanor said, then gestured toward the others. "This is Tom Fletcher, our publican. Sarah Chen runs the village shop, and Peter Hartwell manages what's left of our farms." Each villager stepped forward with warm handshakes and welcoming smiles, but Caleb could see the questions in their eyes. Another outsider come to look at the castle, perhaps. Another potential buyer who would disappear once they realized the magnitude of what they'd inherited. "Quite a place you've got here," Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent watching the castle decay. "Been empty since Lord Edmund passed. Shame to see it like this." "We're just visiting," Caleb said quickly. "Just wanted to see what we'd inherited." "Of course," Eleanor said, but her sharp eyes suggested she saw more than he was saying. "Well, if you need anything during your stay, don't hesitate to ask. The village may be small, but we take care of our own." As the villagers departed, Eleanor lingered behind. "Lord Edmund spoke of you, you know," she said quietly. Toward the end, he was quite excited about finding his American relatives. Said the castle had been waiting for the right family to bring it back to life. "I'm not sure we're the right family," Caleb admitted. "I'm not sure anyone could afford what this place needs." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You'd be surprised what people can accomplish when they have something worth saving. Lord Edmund always said the castle didn't belong to the Blackwoods belonged to the castle." After she left, Caleb stood in the courtyard as darkness settled over the countryside. His children had found a stable area in the great hall and were spreading out their sleeping bags, their voices echoing in the vast space as they planned where they would put furniture, how they would arrange their belongings. The castle was impossible. The restoration costs were astronomical. They had no money, no experience with historical properties, no realistic way to make this work. But as he watched his children claim their space in the ancient hall, as he heard Emma reading to Lucy from a book about castles she'd brought from home, as he saw Michael carefully examining the stone construction with the focused attention he usually reserved for his studies, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in months. He felt like he was home. The Village Chronicle clipping was still in his pocket, the photograph of children playing in this same courtyard during humanity's darkest hour. The Blackwoods had sheltered people then. Maybe they could do it again. Maybe some things were worth attempting even when success seemed impossible. Maybe especially then. The first night in the castle was an adventure in medieval discomfort. They'd brought camping gear, but no amount of sleeping bags could soften stone floors that had been cold for centuries. Caleb lay awake, listening to his children's breathing echo in the great hall, to the wind whistling through gaps in the walls, to the settling sounds of a structure that had weathered 600 English winters. But when morning light streamed through the tall windows, painting golden rectangles across the ancient stones, something magical happened. Emma sat up in her sleeping bag, looked around the vast space, and smiled wider than she had since her mother's death. "We really slept in a castle," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. They walked to the village for breakfast, finding the Raven's Rest already busy with locals who nodded politely but kept their conversations quiet when the Americans passed. Tom Fletcher served them eggs and bacon, while his wife, Margaret, fussed over the children with the attention of someone who'd raised 4 of her own. "How'd you sleep then?" Tom asked, refilling Caleb's coffee. "Castle can be a bit overwhelming first night." "It was perfect," Lucy announced, her 8-year-old certainty allowing no room for doubt. Eleanor Whitmore appeared at their table with a stack of old books and photographs. "Thought you might like to see some of the castle's history," she said, settling into the empty chair. "I've been the unofficial keeper of village records for 30 years. The Blackwood story is quite remarkable." She opened the first book to reveal photographs spanning decades. The castle in its prime, with manicured gardens and gleaming stonework, wedding parties posed in the great hall, Christmas celebrations with the entire village gathered around enormous decorated trees. "Your family was good to this place," Eleanor explained. "When times were hard, and they often were in villages like this, the Blackwoods found ways to help. During the Depression, they employed half the village on restoration projects. During the war, they took in evacuees. When the mines closed in the 70s, Lord Edmund funded retraining programs." Michael studied a photograph of the castle during a village festival, the courtyard filled with families and children. "What happened? Why did it all stop?" Eleanor's expression grew sad. "Time, mostly, and money. Maintaining a place like this costs more than most people realize. Lord Edmund never married, never had children of his own. Toward the end, he was spending everything he had, just keeping the roof from falling in." She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon royal correspondence, according to the label. The papers were old but carefully preserved, written in formal script on official letterhead. "These are from various members of the royal family over the years," Eleanor explained, "thanking the Blackwoods for their service, their charitable work, their stewardship of the castle. Your family has quite a distinguished history." Caleb examined one of the letters, dated 1965, praising Lord Edmund's grandfather for his dedication to preserving England's architectural heritage and supporting rural communities in their time of need. "They really were good people," Emma said, looking at a photograph of Lord Edmund as a young man, surrounded by children from the village. "They still are," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes meeting Caleb's. "The question is what you plan to do with that legacy." After breakfast, they returned to the castle with Tom Fletcher and 2 other villagers who'd volunteered to help assess what could be salvaged. The men walked through each room with the practiced eyes of people who'd spent their lives fixing things, pointing out structural issues and potential solutions. Foundations solid, Tom observed, running his hand along the massive stone walls. These old builders knew their craft. Most of the damage is superficial time and weather, not structural failure. The electrical will need complete rewiring, said James Morrison, who'd served as the village electrician for 20 years. But the bones of the system are still there. Someone knew what they were doing when they installed it. They found rooms that were completely intact, a library with built-in shelves reaching to the ceiling, a formal dining room with an enormous oak table that had somehow survived. The tower rooms were in surprisingly good condition, their thick walls having protected them from the worst of the weather. Place has good bones, Tom concluded as they finished their survey. Question is whether you've got the stomach for the work it'll take. That afternoon, while the children explored the grounds under Eleanor's watchful guidance, Caleb called his brother David. The conversation started, predictably. "Please tell me you're calling to say you've come to your senses," David said without preamble. "Actually, I'm calling to say we might stay." The silence stretched long enough that Caleb wondered if the call had dropped. "Stay?" David finally said. "Caleb, that's insane. You don't have money for a project like this. You don't have skills for a project like this. You don't have—" "I don't have anything to lose," Caleb interrupted. "The house is gone anyway. The kids will have to change schools anyway. At least here, we'd be building something instead of just surviving." "Building what? A money pit? A tourist attraction? You're not a businessman, Caleb. You're not an entrepreneur. You're a guy who worked in manufacturing until he got laid off." The dismissal stung, but it also sparked something defensive in Caleb's chest. "Maybe I'm more than that. Maybe I just haven't had the chance to find out. This isn't about finding yourself. This is about providing for your children, Sarah's children." The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't remind you that your wife wouldn't have wanted you to drag her children halfway around the world on some fantasy adventure." "Sarah believed in possibilities," Caleb said. "She believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had enough faith and worked hard enough. Sarah was a dreamer. You were supposed to be the practical one." After David hung up, Caleb stood in the castle courtyard, watching his children play among the ancient stones. Emma had found a relatively intact section of wall and was pretending to be a princess looking out over her domain. Lucy was collecting interesting stones and arranging them in patterns. Michael sat reading in the shade, but Caleb noticed he kept looking up to watch his sisters, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When had he last seen them this happy? When had he last seen them this free? Eleanor appeared beside him, following his gaze to the children. "They look like they belong here," she observed. "My family thinks I'm making a terrible mistake." Families often do when someone decides to choose hope over safety. Eleanor studied his profile. "What do you think?" Caleb considered the question seriously. The practical side of his mind, the David side catalogued all the reasons this was impossible. No money, no experience, no guarantee of success. A high probability of spectacular failure. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent. It sounded like Sarah, like the woman who'd believed that love could conquer logistics, that faith could overcome circumstances. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "that maybe the biggest mistake would be not trying." Eleanor smiled. Lord Edmund would have liked that answer. That evening, as they prepared for their second night in the castle, Marcus Henderson arrived. Caleb heard the rental car in the courtyard and looked out to see his brother-in-law climbing out of a Mercedes, his expensive suit and leather shoes making him look like an alien who'd landed in the wrong century. "Uncle Marcus," Emma called, running to greet him. But Marcus's expression was grim as he approached the castle entrance. "Caleb, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was everything Caleb had expected and dreaded. Marcus stood in the great hall, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he delivered what was clearly a prepared speech about responsibility and reality. "This has gone far enough," Marcus concluded. "You've had your adventure. Now it's time to come home and face your obligations like an adult." "What obligations?" Caleb asked. "To a house I'm losing? To a community that never really accepted us anyway? To providing stability for these children? To honoring Sarah's memory by giving them the life she would have wanted?" "How do you know what Sarah would have wanted?" Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Because she was my sister. Because I loved her too. And because she never would have put her children at risk like this." The accusation hung in the air between them. Behind Marcus, Caleb could see his children watching from the stairs, their faces uncertain. "You're right," Caleb said finally. "Sarah never would have put them at risk. But she also never would have let them settle for less than they deserved, just because it was easier." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't about what they deserve. This is about what's possible. And this," he gestured around the hall, "this isn't possible for someone in your situation." But as Marcus spoke, Caleb found himself really looking at the great hall for the first time since they'd arrived. Not at the damage or the decay, but at the space itself, the magnificent architecture, the sense of permanence and history, the way the light fell through the tall windows, the way his children's voices sounded when they echoed off these ancient walls. Maybe Marcus was right about what was possible, but maybe possible was the wrong question. Maybe the right question was what was worth attempting, regardless of the odds. 3 weeks into their stay, Caleb found himself standing in what had once been the castle's herb garden, holding a stone tablet that Tom Fletcher had unearthed while helping to clear drainage ditches. The carved symbols were worn by centuries of weather, but still visible, a series of interconnected circles surrounding what looked like a crown, with dates that made his hands tremble. 1387, Eleanor read over his shoulder, running her finger along the weathered carving. The year Thomas Blackwood was granted these lands by King Richard II. But look here, these symbols. I've seen them before in the royal archives. The tablet was heavy in Caleb's hands, substantial in a way that made the inheritance feel suddenly real. This wasn't just a property transfer, it was a continuation of something that had begun over 600 years ago. "What do the circles mean?" Emma asked, having appeared at his side with the silent way children had of materializing when something important was happening. "I'm not certain," Eleanor admitted, "but in medieval symbolism, interconnected circles often represented eternal bonds, family, loyalty, service to the crown. The Blackwoods weren't just landowners. They were guardians of something." Marcus had left the day before, his parting words still echoing in Caleb's mind. "When this falls apart, and it wouldn't expect the family to bail you out again." But the stone tablet seemed to argue against Marcus's certainty. Families who kept things for 6 centuries weren't usually the type to let them fall apart. "Dad," Michael called from across the garden, "you need to see this." They followed his voice to a section of the garden wall where he'd been helping Tom clear ivy. Beneath the green curtain, the stones formed a perfect archway, not damaged or collapsed, but deliberately sealed. The mortar was different from the rest of the wall, newer, though still clearly decades old. "Someone walled this up," Tom observed, running his hands along the seam. "Question is why?" Eleanor examined the sealed archway with growing excitement. "This would have led to the old chapel. Lord Edmund's father sealed it in the 1950s after the roof collapsed. Said it was dangerous, but I always wondered if there was more to it." "Can we open it?" Lucy asked, with the directness of an 8-year-old who saw solutions where adults saw problems. Tom and Caleb exchanged glances. The practical answer was no. They had no idea what lay beyond the seal, no guarantee it was safe, no business disturbing what previous generations had chosen to close off. But there was something about the archway that called to them. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light fell across the stones, or the feeling that they were meant to discover whatever lay beyond. Maybe it was simply that Caleb was tired of accepting other people's decisions about what was possible. "We'll need proper equipment," Tom said finally, "and probably some help from the lads." By evening, half the village had gathered to watch Tom and 3 other men carefully remove the newer stones from the archway. The work was delicate. Walls had stood for centuries, and one wrong move could bring down more than anyone intended. As the last stone came free, they peered into darkness that smelled of age and secrets. Tom's flashlight beam revealed a narrow passage leading deeper into the castle's foundation than any of them had realized existed. "I'm not sure we should," Caleb began, but Emma was already squeezing through the gap. "It's safe, Dad," her voice echoed from within. "There's another room." One by one, they followed her through the passage and into a space that took their breath away. It was a small chapel, perfectly preserved by the sealed entrance. Stained glass windows, filtered colored light across stone walls, covered in carved symbols. At the altar stood a wooden cross that looked as old as the castle itself. But it was what surrounded the altar that made Eleanor gasp. Stone pedestals lined the chapel walls, each bearing carved plaques with dates and symbols. But the pedestals were empty, whatever they'd once held was gone. "This was a treasury," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look at the craftsmanship, the attention to detail. The Blackwoods weren't just keeping family artifacts here. They were protecting something important." Michael found a carved stone panel beside the altar, its surface covered in the same interconnected circles they'd seen on the garden tablet. But these were more elaborate, more detailed, surrounding what was clearly a royal coat of arms. "Why would they seal it up?" Emma asked, running her fingers along one of the empty pedestals. "Maybe to protect it," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe they knew hard times were coming and wanted to keep it safe until the right moment." As they emerged from the chapel, the villagers who'd gathered to watch were buzzing with excitement. Word of the discovery spread through Thornwick faster than wildfire, and by the next morning, Caleb found himself fielding calls from historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters. But it was the call from Richard Henderson that turned his blood cold. "What's this I hear about you digging around in some old chapel?" Richard's voice carried the sharp edge of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Marcus told me you've completely lost your mind, but I thought he was exaggerating. We found a sealed chapel. Eleanor thinks it might have historical significance." "Historical significance?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "Caleb, you're about to lose your house. Your children are sleeping on stone floors in a foreign country, and you're playing archaeologist. Maybe I'm learning something about my family's history." "Your family's history is in Ohio. Your family's history is Sarah, and those 3 children who need their father to stop chasing fantasies and start making practical decisions." After Richard hung up, Caleb found himself back in the chapel, staring at the empty pedestals. What had been here? What had been important enough to hide away, to protect behind sealed stones and forgotten passages? Eleanor appeared beside him, having climbed through the passage with the ease of someone half her age. "I've been thinking about the symbols," she said, settling onto one of the stone benches. "The interconnected circles, the royal connection. There's something familiar about the pattern, but I can't quite place it." "Does it matter?" Caleb asked. "Whatever was here is gone now." "Maybe. Or maybe it's just hidden better than we thought." Eleanor studied the carved panel beside the altar. "The Blackwoods were clever people, Caleb. They survived civil wars, plagues, political upheavals. They knew how to protect what mattered." That evening, as they prepared for another night in the Great Hall, Caleb overheard his children talking in the corner where they'd arranged their sleeping bags. "Do you think we'll have to go back?" Lucy asked, her voice small with worry. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "Dad seems different here, happier, but Uncle Marcus and Grandfather Richard want us to come home." "This feels like home," Emma said firmly. "More than the old house ever did." The conversation pierced Caleb's heart. Emma was right. Something about the castle felt like home in a way their house in Ohio never had. Maybe it was the sense of history, of belonging to something larger than themselves. Maybe it was the way the villagers had welcomed them, not as outsiders, but as the return of something they'd been waiting for. Or maybe it was simply that for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was building something instead of just surviving. But building required resources they didn't have, skills he wasn't sure he possessed, and faith that his family would eventually understand what he was trying to do. The stone tablet sat on the mantelpiece where he'd placed it, its carved symbols seeming to watch over the great hall like ancient guardians. The interconnected circles caught the firelight, reminding him that some bonds were meant to last for centuries. The question was whether he had the courage to honor those bonds, even when everyone he trusted was telling him to walk away. Outside, the English countryside settled into its quiet night rhythms. Inside the castle, 4 Americans lay on sleeping bags, spread across floors that had sheltered Blackwoods for 25 generations. And somewhere in the walls around them, secrets waited to be discovered by those brave enough to look. The Blackwood family ring appeared on a Tuesday morning, discovered by Lucy while she was helping Eleanor tend the castle's herb garden. The 8-year-old's excited shouts brought everyone running to find her holding a tarnished silver signet ring, its surface bearing the same interconnected circles they'd found carved throughout the castle. "It was just sitting there in the dirt," Lucy explained, her eyes bright with discovery. "Like it was waiting for us to find it." Eleanor examined the ring with trembling hands, her historian's training warring with her excitement. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "Look at the craftsmanship, the detail in the carving. This isn't just jewelry, it's a seal of office." The ring was too large for any of them to wear, clearly made for a man's hand. But when Caleb slipped it onto his finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 6 centuries for exactly this moment. "Try it on the wax," Emma suggested, having read enough adventure stories to understand the significance of signet rings. Eleanor produced a candle and some sealing wax from her seemingly endless supply of historical materials. When Caleb pressed the ring into the warm wax, it left a perfect impression, the interconnected circles surrounding a crown, with symbols along the border that Eleanor couldn't immediately identify. "I need to compare this to the Royal Archives," she said, photographing the wax impression from multiple angles. "These border symbols, they're not just decorative, they're a code." As Eleanor hurried off to her research, Caleb found himself staring at the ring on his finger. It felt substantial, meaningful, in a way that went beyond its obvious historical value. For the first time since inheriting the castle, he felt like he might actually belong here. That feeling lasted exactly 3 hours, until his sister Rebecca called. "I just got off the phone with Richard Henderson," she said without preamble. "He's talking about filing for custody of the children." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. "What?" "He says you've abandoned all sense of responsibility, that you're dragging those kids around Europe while living in unsafe conditions, chasing fantasies, instead of providing proper care." Caleb sank into one of the chairs Tom Fletcher had helped him repair. Through the great hall's windows, he could see his children playing in the courtyard, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones. "They're happy here, Rebecca, happier than they've been since Sarah died." "Happy doesn't matter if they're not safe. Richard has lawyers, Caleb. He has money and influence and a very compelling case about an unstable father making irrational decisions." "What kind of case?" Rebecca's sigh carried across the ocean. "Unemployment, financial instability, sudden relocation to a foreign country. Housing them in a structurally unsound historical building without proper utilities or safety measures. It writes itself." After Rebecca hung up, Caleb sat in the growing darkness of the great hall, the family ring heavy on his finger. Everything his sister had said was true. By any conventional measure, he was failing as a father. He'd brought his children to a crumbling castle in a foreign country with no plan, no resources, and no realistic hope of success. But as he watched them through the window, Emma teaching Lucy to identify different types of stones, Michael reading to both of them from a book about medieval history, he couldn't bring himself to believe he was wrong. Eleanor returned near midnight, her arms full of old books and her eyes bright with discovery. "The symbols on the ring," she said without preamble. "I found them. They're not just decorative, they're a map." She spread photocopies across the great hall's massive table, pointing to various documents and diagrams. These border symbols correspond to locations throughout the castle and grounds. "Look, this one matches the carving above the main entrance. This one is identical to the stone we found in the herb garden." Caleb leaned forward, studying the papers. "A map to what?" "I don't know yet, but I found something else." Eleanor pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Lord Edmund's private diary. He mentions the ring specifically. She opened to a marked page and read aloud. The family ring holds the key to our greatest responsibility. Each generation must decide whether they are worthy of the trust placed in them by those who came before. The symbols will guide the worthy to what has been hidden, but only when the need is great and the heart is pure. Hidden where? Emma asked, having appeared at Caleb's shoulder with the silent way children had of materializing during important conversations. Eleanor smiled. That's what we need to figure out. The next few days blurred together as they systematically examined every location marked by the ring's symbols. The carving above the main entrance revealed a hidden compartment containing more old documents. The symbol in the herb garden led them to a loose stone that hid a small cache of medieval coins. But it was Michael who made the breakthrough. "Dad," he called from the library tower, "I think I found something." They climbed the spiral staircase to find him standing before a bookshelf that looked identical to all the others, except for one detail carved into the top shelf, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, was one of the ring's symbols. "I was organizing the books Eleanor brought from the village," Michael explained, "and I noticed this shelf was shallower than the others." Together, they pulled the books away to reveal that the back of the shelf was actually a wooden panel. When Caleb pressed the ring symbol, the panel slid aside with a soft click. Behind it was a narrow space containing a metal strongbox. The box was heavy, clearly old, and locked with a mechanism that none of them recognized. But when Caleb pressed his ring against a small indentation in the lock, it opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside were documents that made Eleanor gasp: parchments bearing royal seals, certificates written in Latin, and maps showing landholdings that stretched far beyond the castle grounds. At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to the future Lord of Blackwood Castle in Lord Edmund's careful handwriting. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice growing more amazed with each word. "To my American cousin, if you are reading this, then the ring has judged you worthy, and the symbols have guided you true. What you hold in your hands is the documentation of a trust established by King Richard II in 1387, granting the Blackwood family stewardship over Crown lands in perpetuity. The trust was sealed during World War II to protect it from potential seizure and has remained dormant for over 80 years. The current value of the holdings, invested and managed by the Crown Estate, is approximately £300 million. But money is not the true treasure. The real inheritance is the responsibility that comes with it, to use this wealth for the betterment of the communities under your care, as your ancestors have done for over 6 centuries. You will face those who do not understand, who will call you foolish for believing in something larger than immediate comfort. But if you have found this letter, then you have already proven you possess the faith necessary to be a true Blackwood. The ring chose you. Trust that choice, as I have trusted it to guide you to what you need most." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Lucy's amazed whisper, "We're really rich." But Caleb barely heard her. His hands were shaking as he held documents that represented more money than he'd ever imagined, more security than his family had ever known. The solution to every problem they faced, the answer to every doubt his relatives had raised. "There's more," Eleanor said softly, pulling out a final document. "Instructions for claiming the trust. It requires formal presentation to the Crown Estate Office in London, with proof of lineage and authentication of the family seal." As the implications sank in, Caleb felt a strange mixture of joy and terror. The money would change, everything would give his children opportunities he'd never dreamed of, would allow him to restore the castle properly, would prove to Richard Henderson and everyone else that he hadn't been chasing fantasies after all. But it would also make them targets. Word of a discovery like this wouldn't stay secret long, and there would be others who would claim they deserved a share of something that had been hidden for so long. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, looking at the documents with wide eyes. Caleb thought of Richard Henderson's threats about custody, of his siblings' certainty that he was failing his children, of all the people who dismissed him as a dreamer with no grasp of reality. "Now," he said, slipping the ring off his finger and looking at its familiar weight, "now we find out if we're really worthy of what our family trusted us to protect." Outside, the English countryside settled into twilight, unaware that the little American family camping in the castle had just discovered they were heirs to one of the largest fortunes in England. And somewhere, in offices across the ocean, phones were already beginning to ring as word of their discovery started to spread. The Royal Trust document changed everything, but not in the way Caleb had expected. Eleanor had insisted on taking the discovery to London immediately, to the Crown Estate Office, where such claims were evaluated. The building was imposing, all marble columns and brass plaques that spoke of centuries of British institutional authority. The clerk who received them, a thin man named Pemberton, with silver hair and careful eyes, examined the documents with the solemnity of someone handling archaeological treasures. "Extraordinary," he murmured, studying the medieval parchments through a magnifying glass. "These appear to be authentic 13th century grants. The seals are correct, the Latin is proper for the period, and the Crown Estate has records of the Blackwood Trust being sealed in 1943. He looked up at Caleb with something approaching awe. "Mr. Marsh, if these documents are verified and our preliminary examination suggests they will be, you are the heir to one of the oldest continuous trusts in English history." The authentication process took 3 days. 3 days during which Caleb and his children stayed in a London hotel that cost more per night than they'd spent on food in a month back home. 3 days of interviews with historians, examinations by document experts, and calls to verify genealogical records that stretched back 6 centuries. And 3 days during which word of their discovery spread through channels Caleb hadn't even known existed. The first sign of trouble came when they returned to Thornwick to find a cluster of expensive cars parked in the village square. "Reporters," Eleanor explained grimly. Someone had leaked news of the trust claim to the press, and now the quiet countryside village was crawling with journalists, hungry for the story of the American family who'd inherited a fortune. But the reporters were nothing compared to what waited at the castle. Marcus Henderson stood in the great hall like he owned it, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who had the sharp-eyed look of attorneys. Behind them, looking uncomfortable but determined, were Caleb's siblings David and Rebecca, who'd apparently flown to England the moment they'd heard about the trust. "There he is," Marcus announced as Caleb entered with his children. "The man who thinks he can claim £300 million because he found some old papers in a wall." "Marcus," Caleb said carefully, "what are you doing here?" "Protecting my nieces and nephew from a father who's clearly lost all sense of reality," Marcus replied. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The media attention, the security risks, the legal complications." One of the lawyers stepped forward, extending a business card. "James Patterson, Patterson, Associates. We represent the Henderson family's interests in this matter." "What interests?" Caleb asked. "This has nothing to do with the Hendersons." "Actually, it has everything to do with us," David interjected, his lawyer's training evident in his measured tone. "Those children are American citizens. Sarah was an American citizen. Any inheritance they receive is subject to American tax law, estate regulations, and family court jurisdiction." Rebecca moved closer to the children, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma, Michael, Lucy, why don't you come with Aunt Rebecca while the grown-ups talk?" "We want to stay with Dad," Emma said, moving protectively closer to Caleb. But Michael was studying the lawyers with the sharp intelligence he'd inherited from his mother. "They're here to take us away, aren't they?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus stepped forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "Caleb, be practical. This trust, if it's even real, comes with responsibilities you can't handle. Tax obligations, legal requirements, public scrutiny. These children need stability, not chaos." "They need their father," Caleb said quietly. "Do they?" David's question hung in the air like smoke. Look around, Caleb. You're camping in a ruin, chasing medieval fantasies while your children sleep on stone floors. The courts will see exactly what we see, a man who's lost all perspective. The second lawyer produced a thick folder of documents. We've filed preliminary custody papers in Ohio, he announced. Given the father's unstable living situation and questionable decision-making, we believe the children would be better served in a more structured environment. With us, Rebecca added gently, where they can have proper schools, proper homes, proper futures. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing from the castle entrance, finally spoke. And the trust? What happens to £300 million that legally belongs to these children? Marcus's smile was cold. The trust will be managed by responsible adults until the children come of age. Properly invested, properly protected, properly administered by people who understand financial management. People like you, Caleb said, understanding dawning like a dark sunrise. People who have the children's best interests at heart, David corrected. People who won't drag them around Europe on some romantic notion about family history. Caleb looked at his children, Emma's frightened eyes, Michael's angry defiance, Lucy's confusion at the tension crackling through the great hall. Then he looked at the family ring on his finger, its symbols catching the afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows. "Get out," he said quietly. "Caleb," Rebecca began. "Get out of my castle, all of you." Marcus laughed. "Your castle? Caleb, you can't afford the property taxes on this place. You can't afford to maintain it. You can't even afford proper housing for your children. What makes you think you can handle a £300 million trust?" But Caleb was no longer the man who'd sat quietly in his Ohio kitchen, accepting defeats and disappointments as inevitable. Something had changed during his weeks in England, something that went deeper than discovering hidden wealth or ancient family secrets. "Because it's mine," he said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Because those symbols chose me. Because that ring fits my finger. Because for the first time in my life I'm standing in a place where I belong." He looked directly at Marcus, then at his siblings. "You've spent years telling me what I can't do, what I'm not capable of, what I don't deserve. But you're wrong. Maybe I was the safe choice, the practical choice, the man who kept his head down and never reached for anything extraordinary. But Sarah didn't marry safe. She married someone she believed could be extraordinary when the moment demanded it." David's expression softened slightly. "Caleb, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect those children." "From what?" "From a father who loves them, from a life that offers them something bigger than suburban mediocrity. From learning that they come from a family that spent 6 centuries protecting something valuable enough to hide for generations. From poverty," Marcus said bluntly. "From instability, from a father who's so lost in fantasy that he can't see reality." "Reality?" Caleb gestured around the great hall, at the ancient stones and soaring arches that had sheltered his family for 25 generations. "This is reality. That trust is reality. The fact that my children are heirs to something extraordinary, that's reality." The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly calculating their next move. Patterson stepped forward with the careful manner of someone delivering bad news. "Mr. Marsh, the custody papers have been filed. The children will need to return to the United States pending resolution of their living situation. The trust claim can proceed, but the children's welfare takes precedence." "Over my dead body," Caleb said. "Dad," Michael said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "We don't want to go back. This is our home now." Emma and Lucy flanked their father, creating a family unit that faced the lawyers and relatives with unified determination. "The courts will decide what's best for the children," Patterson said, "not their emotional attachments to inappropriate living situations." But as the lawyers prepared to serve their papers, Eleanor cleared her throat from the doorway. "I'm afraid there's been a development," she said calmly. "The Crown Estate has completed their authentication. The Blackwood Trust is verified, legitimate, and active. As of this morning, Mr. Marsh is officially the trustee of one of England's oldest charitable foundations." She smiled at the stunned faces around the great hall. Which means, legally speaking, he's no longer unemployed, financially unstable, or unable to provide for his children. He's the administrator of a £300 million trust, with all the legal protections and social standing that entails. Marcus was the first to recover. A trust that can be challenged, a fortune that comes with obligations he can't meet. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, but those challenges will be heard in English courts, under English law, regarding English property and English trusts. The American custody filing has no jurisdiction here. She turned to Caleb with her expression of quiet triumph. Congratulations, Lord Blackwood. Your family has been waiting 6 centuries for you to come home. The title hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lord Blackwood, not Caleb Marsh, the unemployed manufacturing worker from Ohio, not the failure his family had always seen him as, but Lord Blackwood, heir to a name that had been spoken with respect in English corridors of power for over 600 years. The lawyers were already on their phones, clearly regrouping for a more complex legal battle. Marcus stood frozen, his certainty cracking like ice in spring sun. David and Rebecca exchanged worried glances, understanding that the game had just changed completely. But Caleb barely noticed any of them. He was looking at his children, seeing wonder and pride replace the fear that had filled their faces moments before. "Are you really a lord now, Dad?" Lucy asked with 8-year-old directness. Caleb looked at the family ring, at the ancient stones surrounding them, at the future that stretched ahead like an undiscovered country. "I suppose I am," he said. And somewhere in the walls around them, 6 centuries of Blackwood ancestors seemed to approve. The authentication certificate arrived on a grey London morning, delivered by courier to the offices of Whitfield, Pemberton, associates in a ceremony that felt more like a coronation than a legal proceeding. Caleb held the document thick parchment with gold seals and ribbon that declared him the verified and legitimate heir to the Blackwood trust and wondered how his life had become something requiring official authentication. "This makes it real," Jonathan Whitfield explained, his British accent lending gravity to every word. "The Crown Estate has verified your lineage, authenticated the historical documents, and confirmed the trust's validity. You are now, legally and officially, Lord Caleb Blackwood, trustee of the Blackwood Charitable Foundation." But even as Caleb should have been celebrating, darker forces were gathering. The Henderson family had not accepted defeat gracefully. Richard had retained the most expensive legal firm in London, flooding the courts with challenges that ranged from the reasonable to the absurd. They questioned Caleb's mental competency, his ability to manage such wealth, his fitness as a parent, and even his right to use the Blackwood name. "They're trying to bury us in legal fees," Eleanor explained as they sat in the castle's library, surrounded by stacks of court documents. "Even if we win every challenge, the cost of fighting them could bankrupt the trust before you ever gain control of it." David and Rebecca had joined the legal assault, their betrayal cutting deeper than Marcus's predictable greed. His own siblings were arguing in court papers that their brother was mentally unstable, that his children were at risk, that the entire inheritance was a delusion that proved his disconnect from reality. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from the latest filing. "The defendant has abandoned all reasonable behavior, dragging his minor children to a foreign country to live in unsafe conditions while pursuing fantasies of aristocratic inheritance. His actions demonstrate a complete break from rational decision-making and pose an immediate danger to his children's welfare." Michael, now enrolled in the village school but spending his afternoons helping with the legal research, looked up from his homework. "They really think we're in danger here?" Caleb looked around the library walls lined with books collected over centuries, windows offering views of countryside that had remained unchanged for generations, the warm glow of lamplight on ancient stones. His children were healthier, happier, and more engaged with learning than they'd ever been in Ohio. "They think we're in danger of being happy," he said quietly. The legal challenges were just the beginning. Word of the Blackwood Trust had spread through international financial circles, attracting attention from people who made Marcus Henderson look like an amateur. A consortium of investors had appeared, claiming they held liens against the castle from previous owners. A group calling itself the Blackwood Heritage Foundation emerged, insisting they were the legitimate caretakers of the family legacy. Most troubling was the appearance of James Blackwood, a distant cousin from Australia who claimed his great-grandfather had been cheated out of his inheritance in the 1920s. His lawyers argued that the trust should be divided among all living Blackwood descendants, not concentrated in the hands of one American branch of the family. "The hearing is set for next month," Eleanor explained, spreading court schedules across the library table. "London High Court. Every challenge will be heard at once. Custody, legitimacy, financial competency, even the validity of the trust itself." "What are our chances?" Caleb asked. Eleanor's pause was answer enough. Tom Fletcher had become their unexpected strategic advisor, his practical wisdom proving invaluable as they prepared for legal battle. "The way I see it," he said over dinner at the Raven's Rest, "they're trying to overwhelm you with numbers. Multiple challenges, multiple lawyers, multiple angles of attack. But that's also their weakness." "How do you mean?" Caleb asked. "They can't all be right. If you're mentally incompetent, then how did you successfully navigate the authentication process? If the trust is invalid, then why are they fighting so hard to control it? If the children are in danger, then why do they look healthier and happier than they have in months?" Emma looked up from her shepherd's pie. "We do look better, don't we, Dad? Michael's not having nightmares anymore, and Lucy hasn't asked about when we're going home in weeks." It was true. The constant stress that had marked their final months in Ohio had melted away in the English countryside. The children slept deeply, woke eagerly, and spent their days exploring, learning, and laughing in ways Caleb had feared he might never see again. But the legal pressure was taking its toll on him. He'd lost weight, was sleeping poorly, and found himself constantly checking over his shoulder for new threats. The Blackwood ring, once a source of strength, now felt heavy with the weight of centuries of responsibility. "There's something else," Eleanor said quietly. "I've been researching the other claimants, trying to understand their motivations. James Blackwood's case isn't as strong as his lawyers claim. The records from the 1920s show his great-grandfather was compensated for relinquishing his claim. The investment consortium's liens are questionable at best, but Marcus Henderson—" She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she'd discovered. "What about Marcus?" Caleb asked. "He's been in contact with property developers. There are plans preliminary, but detailed to convert the castle into a luxury resort. The kind of development that would destroy everything that makes this place special." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just fighting for control of the trust, was planning to commercialize it, to turn 6 centuries of family history into a profit center for wealthy tourists. "Over my dead body," Caleb said, his voice carrying a steel that surprised everyone at the table. "That might be what it takes," Tom replied grimly. "This hearing isn't just about money or custody. It's about what kind of people get to control places like this. Whether history belongs to those who inherited it or those who can afford to buy it." That night, as his children slept in the great hall now, furnished with proper beds and heating thanks to the trust's preliminary funds, Caleb walked the castle walls alone. The English countryside stretched out below him, peaceful under starlight, but he felt like a man under siege. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "It's not too late to find a compromise. Think about what Sarah would want." But Caleb knew exactly what Sarah would want. She'd want their children to grow up believing they could overcome any obstacle, that love and determination could triumph over money and influence, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they refused to give up. She'd want them to fight. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Eleanor arrived at the castle before breakfast, her face grim with purpose. "I found something," she announced, spreading photocopies across the kitchen table. "I've been researching the legal precedents for trust challenges, and I discovered a case from 1987. Another American heir, another ancient English trust, another family trying to seize control through the courts." She pointed to a legal document that made Caleb's heart race. The Pemberton Trust case. Same legal arguments, same types of challenges, and look at the outcome. Caleb read the summary with growing amazement. The American heir had successfully defended his inheritance against family challenges, but only after proving he understood the historical significance of what he'd inherited and demonstrated his commitment to preserving it for future generations. The judge ruled that trusts like this aren't just about money, Eleanor explained. They're about stewardship. The heir who wins is the one who proves they'll honor the original intent of the trust to benefit the community and preserve the heritage. How do we prove that? Michael asked, having appeared with his usual silent way of materializing during important conversations. Eleanor smiled. By showing the court what you've already done. The castle restoration, the community involvement, the way the village has responded to your presence. By proving that you're not here to cash out, you're here to continue a legacy. The realization dawned slowly. The legal battle wasn't just about defending their right to the inheritance, it was about proving they deserved it. That they understood what it meant to be Blackwoods, what it meant to be guardians of something larger than themselves. We need character witnesses, Caleb said. People who can testify about our intentions, our character, our commitment to the community. We need more than that, Eleanor replied. We need to show the court a concrete plan. How you intend to use the trust, how you'll preserve the castle, how you'll benefit the community. We need to prove that giving you control isn't just legally correct, it's morally right. As they prepared for the battle ahead, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him since the legal challenges began was replaced by a calm determination. This wasn't about money anymore, or even about keeping his children. This was about proving he was worthy of the trust his ancestors had placed in him. The hearing was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare a case that would determine not just their financial future, but their right to call themselves Blackwoods. 3 weeks to prove that some things were more important than legal technicalities or family politics. 3 weeks to show the world that a man who'd been dismissed as a failure his entire life could be exactly the guardian this ancient trust needed. The Blackwood ring caught the morning light as Caleb slipped it onto his finger, its familiar weight now feeling less like a burden and more like armor. Let them come, he thought, all of them. The Hendersons with their lawyers, his siblings with their betrayal, the distant relatives with their claims, the developers with their plans. They would discover what 6 centuries of Blackwoods already knew. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The court summons arrived on official letterhead that made the stakes brutally clear. The High Court of Justice, Chancery Division, in the matter of the Blackwood Trust succession. Every legal challenge, every family betrayal, every question about Caleb's fitness as both father and heir would be decided in a single hearing that would determine his family's future. The Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand felt like a cathedral built to worship the law itself. Caleb walked through its Gothic arches with Eleanor beside him, his children having remained at the castle under Tom Fletcher's protection. The marble halls echoed with the footsteps of centuries of legal proceedings, and Caleb wondered how many other ordinary men had stood where he stood, fighting for something that meant more than money. Remember, Eleanor whispered as they approached the courtroom, this isn't about convincing them you deserve the inheritance, it's about proving you understand what it means to be worthy of it. Inside, the courtroom was already filled. Marcus Henderson sat with his legal team, his expression confident in the way of a man accustomed to winning. David and Rebecca flanked him, their faces carefully neutral but their presence speaking volumes about where their loyalties lay. Behind them sat James Blackwood, the Australian cousin whose own claim had brought him halfway around the world, to challenge Caleb's right to their shared name. But it was the man in the front row who made Caleb's blood run cold, Richard Henderson himself, Sarah's father, who had flown from Ohio to testify against his own son-in-law's fitness as a parent. Justice Margaret Thornley entered with the bearing of someone who had spent decades separating truth from legal fiction. She was younger than Caleb had expected, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who would not be swayed by eloquent arguments that lacked substance. "This is an unusual case," she began, her voice carrying easily through the ornate courtroom. "We have multiple challenges to a verified inheritance, questions of competency, legitimacy, and the best interests of minor children. But at its heart, this case is about something deeper. Whether the defendant understands the true nature of what he has inherited, and whether he can be trusted to honor the obligations that come with it." Marcus's lawyer, Patterson, rose first with the polished confidence of expensive legal representation. His argument was methodical, devastating, and brutally personal. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Caleb Marsh is a man whose judgment has been compromised by desperation and fantasy. After losing his employment and facing foreclosure, he abandoned rational decision-making in favor of a delusional belief that he could transform his family's circumstances through inheritance of a medieval property he cannot afford to maintain." Patterson gestured toward a stack of evidence that seemed to chronicle every mistake Caleb had made since Sarah's death. "The defendant has removed his children from stable housing, reliable education, and family support systems to pursue what can only be described as a romantic delusion about aristocratic inheritance. He has housed them in a structurally unsound historical building, exposed them to international media attention, and created a situation where their basic welfare depends on legal proceedings they are too young to understand." The lawyer's voice took on a tone of practiced sympathy. "This is not about greed, Your Honor. This is about protecting 3 children from a father whose love for them has been clouded by judgment, compromised by grief, financial desperation, and an inability to distinguish between fairy tale and reality." Richard Henderson was called as the first witness, and his testimony was like watching a careful execution. Sarah's father spoke with the measured authority of a successful businessman, painting a picture of Caleb as a man who had always been dependent on others' support, who had never shown the leadership or business acumen necessary to manage significant wealth. "My daughter loved him," Richard said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine sorrow. "But love isn't always enough. Sarah was the dreamer in that relationship. Caleb was supposed to be the practical one, the anchor that kept her dreams grounded in reality. Instead, after her death, he seems to have inherited her tendency toward fantasy without any of her strength or wisdom." The words cut deeper because they contained elements of truth. Caleb had been the practical one, the steady provider who worked his shifts and paid his bills and never reached for anything extraordinary, until now. David's testimony was even more damaging because it came wrapped in the language of brotherly concern. "I've watched my brother struggle since Sarah's death," he said, his lawyer's training evident in every carefully chosen word. "The man sitting in this courtroom isn't the Caleb I grew up with. That man would never have uprooted his children on such a fantastical venture. That man understood the difference between hope and delusion." But it was Rebecca's testimony that nearly broke Caleb's resolve. His sister took the witness stand with tears in her eyes, speaking about her love for Emma, Michael, and Lucy, her concern for their welfare, her belief that their father's judgment had been compromised by grief and desperation. "Those children have been through so much," she said, her voice breaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. "They lost their mother, their home, their entire sense of security. They deserve better than to be dragged around Europe while their father chases medieval fantasies. They deserve the chance to heal, to rebuild their lives in a stable environment, surrounded by family who can provide for their needs." As witness after witness testified to Caleb's unfitness, Eleanor squeezed his hand under the table. "Your turn is coming," she whispered. "Trust the truth." When Justice Thornley called for the defense to present their case, Eleanor rose with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her life studying history and understood that truth had a way of surviving even the most sophisticated attacks. "Your Honor," she began, "the plaintiffs would have this court believe that love, faith, and the courage to reach for something extraordinary are signs of mental incompetence. They argue that a father who chooses hope over surrender, who refuses to accept defeat as inevitable, is somehow unfit to care for his children or manage an inheritance his ancestors spent 6 centuries preserving for exactly this moment. She gestured toward Caleb, and for the first time since the hearing began, he felt someone in that courtroom truly seeing him. Caleb Marsh didn't abandon rational decision-making when he brought his children to England. He made the most rational decision possible for a man in his circumstances, chose to build something instead of merely surviving the destruction of everything he'd worked for. He chose to give his children a connection to something larger than their immediate circumstances. He chose to honor the faith of ancestors who preserved this trust through wars, depressions, and centuries of change, because they believed future generations would prove worthy of it. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word, filling the courtroom with the kind of conviction that couldn't be manufactured by legal training. The plaintiffs speak of fantasy and delusion, but what is truly fantastical believing that ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary circumstances, or believing that wealth and legal maneuvering automatically confer the wisdom to manage a legacy built on 6 centuries of service to community and crown. As Eleanor continued her opening statement, Caleb felt something shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression more attentive. Even some of the opposing lawyers seemed to be listening with genuine interest, rather than simply waiting for their turn to object. But the real test would come when Caleb himself took the witness stand, when he would have to find words to explain choices that had been driven more by faith than logic, more by love than strategy. The man who had spent his life avoiding confrontation, who had always chosen the safe path over the uncertain one, would now have to convince one of England's highest courts that he possessed the courage and wisdom to be worthy of a trust his family had protected for 25 generations. Everything depended on whether he could find the strength to be the man Sarah had always believed he could become. The final judgment began not with legal pronouncements, but with Caleb Marsh taking the witness stand in a London courtroom where 6 centuries of his family's legacy hung in the balance. "State your name for the record," Justice Thornley instructed. "Caleb Marsh," he replied, then paused. The courtroom was silent, waiting. Caleb Blackwood Marsh. It was the first time he'd spoken his full name aloud in legal proceedings, and something about the sound of it, the way it connected him to generations of men who had stood in other courtrooms, faced other challenges, made other choices that echoed through time, gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. Patterson, Marcus's lawyer, approached with the predatory confidence of a man about to deliver a killing blow. "Mr. Marsh, you were unemployed when you received notice of this inheritance, correct?" "Yes." "Facing foreclosure on your home?" "Yes." "With 3 dependent children and no apparent means of supporting them?" "That's correct." Patterson smiled, sensing victory. "So when you received a letter about inheriting a castle in England, you saw it as what a miraculous solution to all your problems." Caleb considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he would have given the safe answer, the answer that wouldn't draw attention or invite conflict. But the man who had discovered hidden chapels and ancient trusts, who had worn his ancestors' ring and felt the weight of centuries of responsibility, was no longer that man. "No," he said quietly. "I saw it as a chance to give my children something I'd never been able to provide, a sense of belonging to something larger than our immediate circumstances. Belonging to a crumbling medieval castle with no heat, no proper plumbing, and no realistic means of restoration. Belonging to a family legacy that has survived 600 years because every generation found the courage to preserve it for the next one." Patterson's expression sharpened. "Mr. Marsh, isn't it true that you have no experience managing large sums of money, no business background, no qualifications that would suggest you're capable of administering a £300 million trust?" "That's true." "Then why should this court believe you're competent to handle such responsibility?" Caleb looked across the courtroom at his family, at Marcus with his calculating eyes, at David and Rebecca with their well-meaning betrayal, at Richard Henderson, whose disapproval had shadowed every family gathering for 15 years. Then he looked at Eleanor, whose faith in him had never wavered, and felt the weight of the Blackwood ring on his finger. Because, he said, his voice growing stronger, competence isn't just about experience or education. It's about understanding what you're responsible for and being willing to sacrifice for it. The Blackwood Trust isn't just money, it's a commitment to preserve something meaningful, to support communities, to honor the faith of people who gave up everything to keep this legacy alive. He turned to face Justice Thornley directly. I may not have business experience, but I understand something about loss, about fighting to protect what matters most, about choosing to build instead of just survive. Patterson pressed on, his questions designed to expose every doubt, every moment of uncertainty, every practical limitation that made Caleb's claim seem impossible. But with each attack, Caleb felt more certain of his ground. Your children have been removed from their schools, their friends, their extended family support system. How is that in their best interests? My children are healthier and happier than they've been since their mother died, Caleb replied. They're learning about their heritage, discovering they're part of something that has meaning beyond immediate comfort. They're sleeping through the night, for the first time, in months. In a medieval castle without proper heating, in a home where they feel they belong. Justice Thornley leaned forward. Mr. Marsh, the court has heard extensive testimony about your supposed unfitness as a guardian and administrator, but I'd like to hear your own assessment. Do you believe you're qualified to manage this trust? The question hung in the courtroom air like incense. Caleb felt the attention of everyone present, felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations, felt the future of his children balanced on his next words. 6 months ago, I would have said no, he answered honestly. 6 months ago, I was a man who had accepted that extraordinary things happened to other people, that my job was to keep my head down and be grateful for whatever life gave me. But something changed when I walked into Blackwood Castle. He paused, searching for words to explain a transformation that felt more spiritual than practical. I realized that the castle wasn't just my inheritance, I was its inheritance. 25 generations of Blackwoods preserved it, protected it, kept it alive through wars and depressions and centuries of change because they believed someday the right person would come along who understood what it meant. Maybe I'm not that person yet, but I'm willing to become that person. Eleanor was called next, and her testimony transformed the courtroom's atmosphere. She spoke not as a lawyer or advocate, but as a historian who had spent decades studying what made some families capable of preserving legacies across centuries, while others lost everything to time and circumstance. The Blackwood family has always faced challenges, she explained. War, economic hardship, social upheaval. But they survived because each generation produced someone who understood that stewardship isn't about personal comfort, it's about responsibility to something larger than yourself. She turned to look at Caleb with profound respect. In 3 months, Mr. Marsh has done more to restore the castle and strengthen the community than was accomplished in the previous decade. Not because he had money or experience, but because he understood instinctively what the trust was meant to accomplish. The judge's questions grew more specific, more probing. She wanted to understand not just Caleb's intentions, but his concrete plans for the trust's administration, his vision for the castle's future, his commitment to the community that had embraced his family. The trust comes with significant obligations, Justice Thornley noted. Annual charitable contributions, property maintenance, public access requirements. These aren't symbolic responsibilities, they're legal obligations that will define your family's life for generations to come. I understand that, Caleb replied, and I welcome it. My children are learning that privilege comes with responsibility, that being a Blackwood means something more than just having money in the bank. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Marcus's team made one final attempt to discredit Caleb's claim. They brought in financial experts who testified about the complexity of trust management, psychologists who questioned the wisdom of uprooting children, even historians who suggested the inheritance might be better managed by established institutions. But their arguments felt hollow against the evidence Eleanor presented of Caleb's practical accomplishments, the restoration work already begun, the community partnerships already established, the clear vision already articulated for the trust's future. Justice Thornley called for closing arguments, and Patterson rose for what everyone expected to be a devastating summary of Caleb's unfitness. Instead, something unexpected happened. The lawyer, who had seemed so confident throughout the proceedings, hesitated, looking at Caleb with what might have been newfound respect. "Your Honor," Patterson said slowly, "the Henderson family's concerns about Mr. Marsh's qualifications remain valid. But it's clear that this case has become about something larger than legal technicalities or financial competence." He paused, seemingly struggling with his next words. "Perhaps the question isn't whether Mr. Marsh is qualified to manage this trust, but whether anyone else would be willing to embrace the responsibilities he's already accepted. The evidence suggests that he understands something about stewardship that can't be taught in business schools or measured by conventional standards." The admission sent shocked murmurs through the courtroom. Even Marcus looked stunned as his own lawyer effectively conceded the moral foundation of Caleb's claim. Eleanor's closing argument was brief and powerful. "This trust has survived 6 centuries because it was always placed in the hands of people who valued legacy over luxury, responsibility over reward. Caleb Marsh may be the most qualified trustee the Blackwood estate has ever had, precisely because he understands that some things are more important than money." Then Justice Thornley retired to consider her decision, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Caleb sat surrounded by his legal team, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. In 2 hours, he would learn whether he was truly worthy of the name he'd inherited, whether his children would grow up as Blackwoods or return to Ohio as the relatives of a man who had reached too far and lost everything in the attempt. The only certainty was that he had finally found the courage to try. 6 months after Justice Thornley's ruling, Caleb stood in the great hall of Blackwood Castle, watching his daughter Emma practice violin beside windows that now gleamed with restored stained glass. The new village foundation charter hung framed on the stone wall, the document that had transformed Thornwick from a dying countryside village into a thriving community that served as a model for rural renewal throughout England. The judge's decision had been swift and unequivocal. This court finds that Caleb Blackwood Marsh is the rightful heir to the Blackwood Trust, both by law and by demonstrated understanding of its purpose. The challenges to his competency are dismissed. The custody claims are denied. The trust shall remain under his administration, with all rights and responsibilities intact. But the real vindication had come in the months that followed, as Caleb proved worthy of the faith Justice Thornley had placed in him. The castle restoration had become a partnership between historical preservation and community development. Local craftsmen worked alongside international experts, learning traditional building techniques while earning wages that allowed them to stay in the village their families had called home for generations. The finished sections glowed with the warm beauty of properly maintained medieval architecture, thick stone walls, soaring wooden beams, and floors that would last another 6 centuries. Michael appeared beside him, now 15 and carrying himself with a confidence that had emerged as he'd learned to see himself not as the son of a failure, but as heir to a legacy of service and stewardship. "The school group from London just arrived," Michael reported. "Eleanor's giving them the tour, but she wanted to know if you'd speak to them about the Trust's educational programs." Caleb smiled. The Blackwood Educational Foundation had become one of their most successful initiatives, bringing students from urban areas to experience countryside life, while supporting local schools with resources they could never have afforded otherwise. Emma had suggested the program after realizing how much she'd learned simply by living in a place where history felt alive. "Tell her I'll be there in a few minutes," Caleb said, then watched his son stride away with the easy authority of someone who knew his place in the world. Lucy bounded into the hall with 8-year-old energy, her arms full of wildflowers she'd picked from the castle's restored gardens. "Dad, Mrs. Chen says the village festival is going to be the biggest ever this year. Are we really going to have knights and everything?" "Knights, musicians, craftsmen, demonstrations, and a feast that the whole village will share," Caleb confirmed, helping her arrange the flowers in a vase that had been made by the castle's own pottery workshop. another program that provided both employment and preservation of traditional skills. The Thornwick Renaissance Festival had grown from a small community celebration into an internationally recognized event that brought thousands of visitors to the village each summer. But unlike the commercial exploitation Marcus Henderson had envisioned, the festival remained focused on authentic cultural preservation and community benefit. Eleanor entered the hall carrying a leather portfolio that had become familiar over the months. The Foundation's monthly reports, always delivered in person, because she understood that stewardship required constant attention to detail. "The numbers continue to improve," she announced, settling into the chair beside the great fireplace where they held their informal business meetings. "Village employment is up 40% from last year. 3 new families have moved to Thornwick, and the school enrollment has doubled. The Crown Estate Office sent their congratulations on our rural development model." She opened the portfolio to reveal photographs of other villages that were implementing programs based on the Blackwood model. Heritage preservation, combined with economic development, community ownership, balanced with professional management. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the excitement she always felt when discovering historical connections. "I received a call from Lord Edmund's solicitor. Apparently, he left additional documents in his personal effects letters and photographs that were sealed until 1 year after the trust was successfully transferred." She produced an envelope bearing Lord Edmund's familiar seal, its contents having waited for this exact moment when they could be certain the American heir had proven worthy of the complete Blackwood legacy. Inside were photographs spanning decades. Lord Edmund, as a young man working alongside villagers to restore war damage, hosting community celebrations in the Great Hall, overseeing charitable projects that had supported thousands of families over the years. But it was the letter that made Caleb's hands tremble. "My dear American cousin," Eleanor read aloud, "if you are reading this, then you have accomplished what I prayed you. Would you have proven that blood truly runs true, that the values we have preserved for 6 centuries still live in those who carry our name. You have faced the doubt of those who could not understand, the greed of those who would exploit what we have protected, and the fear that comes with accepting responsibility for something larger than yourself. Most importantly, you have chosen service over comfort, legacy over luxury, community over personal gain." Eleanor's voice grew softer as she continued. "The money was never the true inheritance. The castle was never the real treasure. What you inherited was the opportunity to be part of something that has touched thousands of lives across centuries. The chance to add your chapter to a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. You have proven yourself worthy not just of our name, but of the trust that name represents." The letter concluded with a passage that brought tears to Caleb's eyes. "Give your children the knowledge that they come from people who chose to preserve rather than consume, who built rather than merely acquired, who understood that true wealth is measured not in what you possess, but in what you give to others. The Blackwood name has been in good hands. May it remain so for another 6 centuries." As evening settled over the countryside, Caleb walked the castle walls alone, as had become his custom. Below him, the village of Thornwick glowed with warm light from windows of homes, where families were gathering for dinner, where children were doing homework, where people were living the secure, meaningful lives that the Blackwood Trust had been created to protect. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Saw the article about the foundation in the Times. Mom would be so proud." The reconciliation with his siblings had taken months, but it had come. David now served as the Trust's legal advisor, his expertise invaluable in navigating the complex regulations governing charitable foundations. Rebecca visited regularly, bringing her own children to experience the magic of a place where their uncle had learned to believe in himself. Even Richard Henderson had grudgingly admitted that Caleb had exceeded expectations. "You've proven me wrong," he'd said during his last visit. "Sarah always said you were capable of extraordinary things. I should have listened to her." Marcus remained the lone holdout, his relationship with the family severed by his inability to accept that some victories couldn't be bought. But even his opposition had served a purpose. It had forced Caleb to prove his worthiness not just to others, but to himself. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Emma peered out onto the wall walk, her violin case in her hand. "The sunset looks beautiful from up here," she said, joining him at the stone battlements. "Are you thinking about Mom?" "Always," Caleb admitted. "But tonight I'm thinking about how proud she would be of who you and Michael and Lucy are becoming." Emma leaned against his side, comfortable in the way children were when they felt completely secure in their place in the world. "Do you ever miss Ohio?" Caleb considered the question seriously. "I miss some things, but this is home now, isn't it? This is where we belong." "This is where we've always belonged," Emma corrected with the wisdom of a child who had never doubted her father's choices. "We just didn't know it yet." As stars appeared over the English countryside, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here from a kitchen table covered in overdue bills to a medieval castle, where they were guardians of a legacy that stretched back 25 generations. From being the family that others pitied to being the family that others looked to for leadership and inspiration. The transformation hadn't been about money, though the financial security was undeniably important. It hadn't been about status, though the respect they'd earned in the community was gratifying. It had been about discovering that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they had something worth protecting, something worth building, something worth passing on to future generations. The Blackwood ring caught starlight as Caleb adjusted it on his finger, no longer the unfamiliar weight of inherited responsibility, but the comfortable symbol of earned authority. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove worthy of the trust placed in him. The foundation had projects planned across 3 counties, the castle had restoration work scheduled for the next decade, and the village had growth initiatives that would require careful balance between progress and preservation. But tonight, standing on walls that had protected his family for 6 centuries, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a community that was thriving because of choices he'd had the courage to make, Caleb Marsh Lord Blackwood felt something he'd never experienced before in his life. He felt like the man Sarah had always believed he could become. And in the great hall below, his children slept deeply in a home that would shelter their children and their children's children for generations yet to come. The Blackwood legacy was secure in hands that understood its true value, preserved by people who knew that some things were worth any sacrifice necessary to protect them. The story that had begun 6 centuries ago would continue, its next chapter written by an American family who had learned that home wasn't a place you were born, but a place where you chose to belong.